Welcome to session 1 of the 2022 NIJ Forensic Science R&D Symposium. My name is Greg Dutton. I'm a Forensic Science R&D Program Manager at NIJ, and I'll be moderating this session. I manage NIJ's trace evidence and impression and pattern evidence portfolios, as well as NIJ's Graduate Research Fellowship Program. We are very pleased to be able to present recent work by NIJ-supported researchers in these oral sessions. But I should note that this represents just a small portion of all the work funded under our program. Don't forget to take a look at the poster session as well to hear about more great NIJ-funded research. The first 3 talks of this session will focus on impression and pattern evidence topics, like latent prints, facial comparisons, and footwear. After those presentations, we'll have time for a Q&A session with the speakers, and then we'll take a short break. The final 3 talks will deal with trace evidence topics, like glass, paint, and geological materials. And we'll have another short Q&A session with those speakers. If you have any questions for the speakers as you listen, you can enter them into the chat, and we'll get them answered during the Q&A sessions. Our first presenter is Tom Busey, a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University, which is the oldest psychology department in the United States. He's worked in forensics since 2002, has had 3 NIJ grants, and has published on a variety of disciplines within forensics. Today, he'll be discussing the validation of conclusion scales. Welcome, Professor Busey.
The topic of this talk is validating conclusion scales in the forensic sciences. And it's actually 2 talks because they're 2 projects that are related to each other. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes with each talk. And there's more details on some papers that we listed on a website at the end of this talk. In the first talk, we're going to be calibrating the perceived strength of evidence in forensic testimony statements. And this is with my colleague, Morgan Klutsky. When we think about articulation language that's used in the pattern comparison disciplines, how are different phrases interpreted by laypersons? After all, this interpretation is part of the calibration of forensic conclusions. You need to not only understand what you're saying, but also how that's interpreted by the layperson. So here's how I'd like to think about the actual process. When an examiner is doing a comparison, say fingerprints, they accumulate evidence in favor of different propositions, say the same source proposition or the different sources proposition down here, call it some perceived detail and agreement, and that gets translated by some function theta to a verbal conclusion, say identification or inconclusive or exclusion. And the second part of the talk is actually addresses this transformation right here. But once the examiner makes a conclusion, that has to be interpreted properly by the consumer in terms of inculpatory or exculpatory evidence. And that's through second transformation here. And the first part of the talk addresses this transformation here, making sure that what the examiner intends is interpreted properly by the consumer, say a layperson, the jury, a detective, or prosecutor. In prior work, Thompson et al. Showed pairs of statements like this. They asked which of the following 2 conclusions would seem stronger if you heard it, meaning more convincing to you that the suspect is the source of the print. And they gave pairs of statements like, I individualized the crime scene fingerprint, or it is highly probable that the suspect is the source. And based on this, they found that categorical conclusions tend to be interpreted as providing strong support, which they actually found is kind of concerning because it possibly overinterpreted the strength of the evidence in that discipline. So it's a really nice study, and they did a bunch of really nice work. A downside of this approach, though, is it presents each statement in isolation, or at least in pairs from disparate scales, rather than as a complete scale. And that, I think, is a bit of a problem. So let's look at a different approach to this here. And I'm going to show you a visualization that represents a study that we did, and then I'll show you the data from it. So the links are provided in the talk, but basically when a subject went to the experiment, they did some initial stuff, a consent form, did a little tutorial and a little introductory video, but eventually they saw a scale like this, and they had to read and interpret each of these different scales and items on this scale, and they had to sort them so that they were in order with evidence for the same source proposition at the top and evidence for different sources proposition at the bottom. So once they thought they had the right sort order, they clicked check. And if they were correct, then we gave them a visualization that looked like this. So this vertical axis is from the most support imaginable for the same source proposition to the most amount of support for the different sources proposition. And they simply took each of these categorical or different conclusion statements and dragged them up and down so that they corresponded to the amount of strength that each statement implied for each of these two propositions. And when they found what they thought was the correct location, they clicked next, and they could place this one, maybe place this one down here. They could go back and remove these if they wanted to. And once they got to the end of that particular scale, then they went on to the next scale. So there was another scale here. So that was the nature of this experiment. And then there were some demographics at the end. So you're welcome to follow this link. The 7 key actually skips the video if you don't want to listen to me drone on for 8 minutes. So here are examples of the scales. Then the traditional scale identification uses a definition that we took from the draft OSAC definition. It may have changed since then because it's not finalized. Inconclusive or exclusion. We have strength of support that actually has a very similar definition to identification in this, except for the name here changes. We include support for common source. And then we included some scales like the UCSIL Defense Forensic Science Center likelihood model that has things like this correspondence is greater than 98% of the impressions made by the same source and less than 1.1% of impressions made by different sources. Or in other situations, we have 50% and 1%, or they actually have a category of limited association with insufficient statistical support. So here's another conclusion scale that was included, and we wanted to know how people would interpret this. We also included a random match probability scale, even though random match probabilities really aren't used that much in fingerprints. So the end of the comparisons or the end of the experiment looked something like this, where the subject would have all of their statements placed on the scale appropriately. And that's what our data consists of, where each of these conclusion statements were placed on our scale. So we recruited latent print examiners through mailing lists. They were unpaid. They had to be qualified to testify on fingerprint evidence in the United States. Our second group is laypersons, and this task takes a fair amount of thought and consideration. We didn't want to just randomly use people. So we personally recruited members of the Bloomington community or friends and family, church and community members, former students, close associates, people we thought we could trust. They were also unpaid, they had to be jury eligible. And then the final group was Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which was similar to the other study that I mentioned at the beginning. And we had these requirements here. So we had 126 latent print examiners at the end, 45 of our trusted novices, and 143 Amazon Turkers. Turns out the examiners are slightly older and slightly better educated than the other two groups. The full details are in the paper. It turns out that we needed to exclude some of our subjects because some of the Turkers, frankly, didn't take the task seriously. So if you rushed through the experiment, we excluded you. We also, because we told people the correct sorting when we made them sort each scale, if they violated either the traditional or the strength of support scales, after we told them the correct order, if they violated that ordering when they were placing them on the vertical slider, then we excluded that subject. And it turns out that that ended up excluding almost no fingerprint examiners or Bloomington community members, but 51 out of the 143 Mechanical Turk participants. The bottom line, some MTurk subjects don't take the task seriously, so having our trusted novices from Bloomington addresses a lot of those concerns. Because the results are so similar between the two groups of the public, we're going to combine them. So I'm going to show you the raw data and also the ordinal relations modeling. So this graph here shows the distribution of responses for both subject groups. We have the examiners in blue, we have the general public in orange. The x-axis here is the location of the scale. That was the vertical location when they were dragging the statements up and down. And the y-axis here shows the different scales that were used in the experiment. So identification, extremely strong for common source, What we see here is that there's a bit of a discrepancy. Well, first of all, we find that really nobody understands what random match probabilities mean. The data is sort of all over the map here. Both examiners and the novices don't really know where to place that. The use-of-seal language, the likelihood ratio language, is actually also misinterpreted. It's placed almost exactly by both groups right at 98. But the two scales really don't have anything to do with each other. So this demonstrates a very surface level understanding of the likelihood ratio language is. There are also some differences between the two subject groups in terms of how they're interpreting extremely strong support for common source. And I want to highlight that next here. So there's fairly strong agreements across items between the two groups overall, but there's some disagreement on extremely strong support for common source. No one really understands random match probabilities, and the use-of-seal language is interpreted literally, even though the two scales have nothing to do with each other. Okay, let's talk about the analysis on ordinal relations here. What we can do is create a dominance matrix across participants in a group, which computes the number of times that each statement was placed above each other statement. For example, we might find in some subject group that identification dominated extremely strong support for common source 156 times, meaning it was placed above it in the experiment. But extremely strong support dominated identification just 73 times. Therefore, we would imply, and the model would compute, that identification means more support for the common source proposition than extremely strong support for common source does. So that's the nature of this data. The Thurstone-Mosteller model converts those ordinal relations using the dominance matrix and a variant of the generalized linear model. It's basically just going to give you one number that reflects how much support the subjects feel this particular statement gives for the same source proposition. What's the overall strength of evidence inferred from the dominance matrix? So the data looks something like this. So the y-axis here are all of the different statements that were used in our experiment. And the x-axis here is the general linear model coefficient, which is basically how much support there is for the same source proposition. And there's a lot of data here, but I just want to point out that examiners distinguish between identification and extremely strong support for common source. So here's extremely strong for common source right here, and here is identification right here. And you can see there's a big difference between those two. Novices, on the other hand, do not distinguish between these two. So here is identification, here is extremely strong support for common source, and you can see that these two are very, very similar. So the general public does not distinguish between identification and extremely strong support for common source. So here's a quick summary of these results. Experts distinguish between identification and extremely strong support for common source, but members of the general public do not. We saw in the raw data that likelihood ratio style language use-of-seal is treated literally on this scale, and that reflects a surface level understanding of what it means. And we saw that random match probability statements are confusing. In fact, a lot of observers, a lot of our subjects from both groups actually reversed the ordering and placed a random match probability of 1 in 10 above a random match probability of 1 in 100,000. In the second part of the talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about how examiners are using or might use different kind of scales. So we'll come back to the data that I just talked about because the two studies reinforce each other. But in this study, we're going to be validating the strength of support conclusion scales for fingerprint, footwear, and tool mark impressions. And this is both with Morgan Klutsky, Alyssa Nezi, and my colleague Jan van der Kolk. The central question here is, if we change articulation language, what happens to examiner behavior? In fingerprints, we have traditional categories like ID, inconclusive, exclusion. Footwear is a variant of this, but it includes statements about the degree of association. And tool marks is also a variant of this scale, but includes statements about insufficiency. And these both include some elements of class characteristics as well. There are some problems with this scale, some of which we've already touched on. First, categorical conclusions tend to be overinterpreted. These categorical conclusions are conclusions. Literally, it's right there in the name. They are posteriors and therefore must consider the priors, that is, how good your detectives are, even though this seems to be a point of either confusion or outright denial among many examiners. And finally, we should ask, Are examiners triers of fact? Should they be making conclusions, or should they simply be describing the observations given to propositions? Um, in some ways, the consumers want a yes or no, a go no kind of signal. But on the other hand, the examiners don't have all of the evidence of the case. So strength of support scales are designed to, as an alternative, to express the probability of the observations given to propositions, same source and different source. There's a little jujitsu about whether these are likelihoods or posterior language, but in general, we're moving away from the absolutist language that is in the categorical conclusions. So this language must be interpreted properly by both the examiner and the jury, and that's one of the reasons we did the first study. But in this second study, we asked, how would moving to strength of support scales affect examiner behavior? So we've already talked about this particular graphic here. So now we're talking about, we've got some internal evidence scale, which presumably doesn't really change if you change the articulation language, but this transformation might. And the way that they report their conclusions would change if you gave them a different scale to use. So in our prior work, we tested expanded conclusion scales with casework like fingerprint comparisons and fingerprint examiners. We had 27 different examiners, and they each did 60 casework-like comparisons. Half were mated and half were not mated because we created a stimuli. Half the time they used a traditional scale, and half the time they used an expanded traditional scale with support for common source added. So they either had 3 choices here, or they had 5 choices that included these support for different sources and support for common source. Here's an example of the interface that we used. Participants could zoom or rotate, they could mark these up. They always knew on each trial what the scale would be that they were using. Is it the traditional or the expanded traditional? And this paper has been published. But what we found was that fingerprint examiners, when you give them an expanded scale, they redefined the definition of identification, using it less often. They became more risk averse. So this demonstrated to us that before you propose a change to your conclusion scale, test it first. So the goal of this is to compare the traditional conclusion scales to strength of support scales in 3 pattern comparison disciplines, using casework-like stimuli and an online interface to conduct the comparisons. The data was collected online, it was self-paced, and trials could be paused. So you've seen this before. We used the same interface for fingerprints. They could be rotated, zoomed in, marked, and then you always knew which scale they were using on that particular trial. The footwear interface, we tried to make this as similar to a limb system as possible. So the images, we have the question images here, and then 2 versions of the known. The known could be dragged on top of the question and made transparent, and you could look for alignment. You could rotate these, you could hide them, change the colors. You had the photo here of the heel from the known impression. And on each trial, the examiners would know which of the 2 scales they would be using, either traditional or strength of support. The tool mark was similar. There was a split screen that you could slide the slider back and forth, and this split screen would move back and forth. You could also drag both of these images around. So you could drag this up and down to try to find alignment here between these 2. And you always knew which of the scales you would be using. The fingerprint stimuli were collected in our lab using black powder dusted on plastic tumblers. The difficulty was similar to the FBI Noblest black box study. These are ways of computing difficulty, and you can see that the sensitivity in our particular study is very similar to that in the black box study. So we're comparing scales, so the exact difficulty is less important, but we think that we're very similar to other error rate studies, although I want to stress this is not an error rate study. The footwear stimuli were collected in our lab. We simulated blood using chocolate ice cream slapped on white paper. And our test impressions were with petroleum jelly and black powder on a lifting substrate. And then we had a photograph of the heel. There's a GitHub site that's referenced in the papers that you can download all the images from if you'd like. The tool mark stimuli were taken from chisels and screwdrivers. The marks were made in heavy-duty aluminum foil, and they were photographed with oblique lighting. We used a couple of different angles that we thought would be consistent with using a screwdriver or a chisel to open a window on an aluminum window frame. And again, all the images are available. Here's an example of the jig that was used to create the test impressions, and we use these two angles here to create our test impressions. So as with the previous study, each participant does 60 trials, half are with a traditional scale and half are with a strength of support scale. They know on each trial which scale they're using. Of half the trials are mated and half are non-mated. And there's a 30-minute timer to avoid participant dropout. It's important to point out one critical element of this particular design. The images are randomly assigned to one of the two scales for each participant. And that randomization was re-randomized for each participant. And what this means is that any differences in difficulty average out across participants. So what does that mean? Well, if we find on average, for example, that examiners use the highest conclusion scale less often in one scale relative to the other, this can't be because the scale had harder images, because the images were randomly assigned. So any differences across all our participants in the use of the highest category has to be due to something else other than image difficulty. Okay, so they had to be qualified to testify in their discipline in the United States. We had 34 fingerprint examiners, 32 footwear examiners, and 20 toolmark examiners. I'm going to present the raw frequencies of responses, and then there's also in the paper a fit of those response frequencies using a model called signal theory, which estimates examiner ability as well as where their decision criteria are. If you're interested in that, you can find the paper on our website. Here is the raw frequency data for the fingerprint examiners. So we have data from the traditional scale, which has just 3 possible statements. And we have both mated and non-mated pairs here. So we have, in this data set, 245 correct identifications. If we switch to the strength of support scale and look at that data, we find that the number of times that they use that highest category, in this case, extremely strong support for common source, drops from 245 to 174, and that's a significant drop. So some of these must have distributed to this category right here. If we look at the footwear examiners, they have in their traditional scale 151 correct identifications to mated pairs, but 160 extremely strong support conclusions to mated pairs. They really don't show differences between their use of these two scales. They seem pretty consistent regardless of whether they're using traditional scale or the strength of support scale. And if you compare across here, there's maybe some smaller differences between their use of high degrees of association versus strong support for common source. But by and large, the rest of this is pretty consistent. So 260 correct exclusions and 258 correct extremely strong support for different source conclusions. The tool marks are very similar to the fingerprint examiners. So we have 178 correct identifications on the traditional scale, and that drops to 136 correct extremely strong support for common source, which means that some of these must have distributed over to support for common source here. So they look a lot like the fingerprint examiners, meaning they become risk averse when you give them the strength of support scale. So here's the summary of these data. Switching from a traditional scale to a strength of support scale made fingerprint examiners and toolmark examiners more risk averse. They were less likely to use the highest category of the strength of support scale. They simply use extremely strong support for common source less often than identification. Footwear examiners were fairly stable across their scales. I don't think that this effect right here is due to increasing the number of categories in the strength of support scale, because toolmark examiners had the same number of statements in their scales for the traditional and the strength of support scales. So what does this all mean? Well, there's inherently a paradox across the two studies. Fingerprint examiners believe that extremely strong support for common source provides less support for the common source proposition than identification does. That was part 1 of the talk. However, would give it a chance to actually use this scale in practice, fingerprint examiners at least are less likely to use that than identification. And that was part 2 of this talk. So that's a disconnect that I think we need to think about. What is it about extremely strong support for common source that causes this paradox? Well, why are they more risk averse when with the extremely strong support? They could be less familiar with this term. That's certainly true. Maybe extremely is too extreme. And I would ask whether the language is calibrated against the strength of the discipline. So let's think about how extremely is treated in DNA. So in fingerprints, the black box studies have shown that the error rate is about 0.1%. And if you translate that to a likelihood ratio, the strength of that evidence is about 1,000 on a likelihood ratio, just roughly speaking, back of the envelope. Well, the verbal equivalence for one scale I found, extremely here, has a likelihood ratio of greater than 10,000. So that's the difference of 10 there. And another scale I found, not even extremely, but very strong support for inclusion, is greater than 1,000,000 for a likelihood ratio. So DNA and fingerprints have very different interpretations of what the verbal equivalence should be for their evidence. So here are some suggestions and some final thoughts. Extremely seems complicated. There's a disconnect between how examiners interpret it and they actually use it. Novices treat extremely strong support for common source as equivalent to identification. Examiners may become risk averse when it's available, and maybe appropriately so, because it's treated as identification by laypersons. And I wonder whether it's okay to use extremely strong support for common source where the discipline error rate is 0.1%, which might be a likelihood ratio around 1,000. So some final thoughts here. Laypersons are really bad at gauging absolute strength of evidence, but they're better if you tell them what you could have said but didn't. So tell them the whole scale. And if you're going to propose a different scale or an expanded scale, test it to see how your examiners are going to use it. I think that strength of evidence scales are probably better than categorical conclusion scales, but I think everyone understands that the end goal here is numerical estimates of the strength of evidence, similar to likelihood ratios in DNA. I know we're getting there with some of the work that UCSL has been doing. There are some other approaches that seem promising. Even before we get there, though, I think we need to reconsider whether we even need to be making categorical conclusion statements. And we maybe should quit making posterior decisions at all and simply phrase things in terms of the strength of support for two propositions. And with that, I'll end my talk, and I'll invite you to go to the website for papers. And if you'd like to try the demo, you can go to this link right here. Thank you.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, Tom. If you have any questions for Professor Busey, please type them in the chat and we will get them answered during the Q&A session. Our next presenter is Larry Tang, an associate professor at the University of Central Florida in both the Department of Statistics and Data Science and the National Center for Forensic Science. Professor Tang is a statistician specializing in statistical methodology and collaborative research. His current methodological research areas include statistical methods in forensics, diagnostic medicine, group sequential designs, substance abuse research, and criminology. Today, he'll be discussing the assessment of error rates among multiple examiner groups. Welcome, Professor Tang.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Tang. I'm a statistician at the National Center for Forensic Science at University of Central Florida. I would like to thank NIJ for the opportunity to present my research on assessing error rates in multiple examiner groups by using some statistical methods. It's a joint work with my student Tai, who is also supported by NIJ grant. So here's the outline of my talk. I will briefly talk about some concepts about error rates and also receiver operating characteristic curves. And I will get into the regression part that's going to be used to estimate the ROC curve from ordinal data. Since the ordinal data are usually occur from the black box study, for example, the NIST face recognition study, you ask the human examiners to give the ordinal rating. And to deal with those kind of data, we will need some specific regression technique for that. So I will talk about how to apply the method we developed to face recognition. And finally, there will be some conclusion. So in forensics evidence analysis, we have two pieces of evidence. One piece from the crime scene and that's unknown. The other piece from suspect, so that's already known. And we have two hypotheses. One is the common source hypothesis. We will say the two pieces of evidence are come from the same source. And the different source hypothesis means we have two pieces of evidence come from different sources. And usually the examiners have to make the judgment to see whether the evidence come from same source or different sources. And during those decisions, there might be some errors, and that's the proportions of cases with a false conclusion. And in the high-profile reports from National Academy of Science and the PCAS, they call for the assessment of the accuracy, and also they want to estimate the error rates in the forensic analysis. And that's actually motivate our research, since we want to estimate the error rates, and we also want to estimate the uncertainty of the error rates as well. So here's the diagram of the error rates. So as I mentioned, we have the unknown source and the known source, and we will have decision score. The decision score could come from computer algorithm, could also come from, say, human examiners. And for human examiners, it's easier to give the binary decision or the ordinal decision. And the continuous decision scores usually come from the computer algorithm. And the binary decision, that's what you can see from the FBI Nobody's fingerprint study. And the ordinal decision score, you can see that from the NIST face recognition studies. So that's actually the two studies, very large scale black box studies. For the binary decision, we will have two possibilities for the truth. We could have, say, fingerprints from the same person. We could also have fingerprints from different person. So that's the two possibilities. And if the fingerprints or faces come from the same person, but we exclude the suspect, we will make a false negative error. And the rate will be the false negative rate. So that's one type of the error rate. There's another type of error rate as well. Suppose the fingerprint or faces come from, say, different person, then, but we individualize the suspect. That means we are actually making a false positive error. So the rate will be the false positive rate. So that's for the binary decision. That's usually simpler to estimate. You just calculate the proportion. But for the ordinal or continuous decision, need a little bit more work, since the false negative rate and the false positive rate will depend on the threshold. So you can think about, you choose a threshold C, and if the decision score is less than C for the first choose, say the fingerprints come from the same source, but you exclude by saying the score is less than the threshold, then you get the false negative rate. So that's a probability for the score less than the threshold. As you are changing the threshold, the false negative rate and the false positive rate will change. So the way to visualize that is use the so-called receiver operating characteristic curve. So here give the definition for it. So that's what we have seen from the previous diagram. And you can see as we change the threshold from negative infinity to positive infinity, the true positive rate will decrease and the 1 minus false positive rate will increase. So the way to visualize the relationship between these two error rates is through this ROC curve. So it's very commonly used in diagnostic medicine, and so nowadays people use that for forensic error analysis as well. And here there are different scenarios. So you can say we have two populations. So you can say one is from the decision scores on the same source, and the other one is the decision scores on the different source. And if we have very high accuracy, That means we will have the two sets of scores very well separated. So that's what you can see from here. That will lead to very high ROC curve. But if the two sets of scores are very close to each other, say for example, the scores from same source, scores from different source, they are very close, then that means the either computer algorithm or the human examiners do not really have very high accuracy. So the ROC curve will go towards the diagonal line. And if the ROC curve is on the diagonal line, that means it's just like a flip a coin and decide whether the two pieces of evidence come from same source or different source. So apparently there's no accuracy in that case. So for continuous scores from computer algorithm, so we can see that, for example, we look at the face recognition accuracy. We could have same sources, different sources. These two images come from same person. These two come from different persons. And we have genuine imposter score. That's very commonly used term in biometrics. And that means it's matching scores for the same individual or same source and matching score from different individual or different sources. And we may also have different, say, quality categories as well. For example, good, bad, ugly. So that's defined by Phillips in 2012 paper. So you can think about the quality will be one of the characteristics of the subject images. And there may be some other demographics, for example, age, gender. So that could be also the characteristics of the images, and they may also affect the accuracy or the error rate when you try to look at the either algorithm or the examiner's accuracy. So if we ignore the quality, so that's the first one here. So we just pull everything together. We get the scores from the same source, scores from different source, and you can see in this black line here, that's the ROC curve that tells us the true positive rate versus false positive rate. But if we take into account of the quality measure, the quality of the images, for good quality, the ROC curve is higher, and for ugly quality, then is much lower. So you can say here, one size doesn't fit all. So we have different quality, we have different age, we have different gender, then they're all gonna affect the ROC curve. So that's gonna affect the error rates as well. So that's for continuous data. And we have some references here. We did the regression to estimate the ROC curve, and we apply to the face recognition when we have continuous data. So I want to focus on the ordinal data. So you can think about if we ask human to give the ratings, it's going to be almost impossible to give the continuous score. So we just ask them to give the ordinal score, say, all the binary decision. Like binary decision is really easier, but ordinal score will be able to capture more information. So this is actually done by NIST on their face recognition black box study. So they asked the human examiners. So they actually have several groups of examiners. For example, they have the face examiner, they have the fingerprint examiner, they also have so-called super recognizer. That's normal people who have like a super ability to recognize faces, but they don't really have formal training. So they ask those people to rank, to give the rating to pairs of images. So if the, so from the scale of -3 to 3, so 0 means they don't really have much idea whether they are from, the images are from same person or not. And the 3 means they have very high confidence that two images come from the same person. And -3, that means they have high confidence that two images come from different individuals. So those are the ordinal score. And for the ordinal score, it's going to be a little bit tricky to do the regression. So that's why we want to use the so-called ordinal regression to be able to account for this ordinal score. So in the original paper published by Phillips in PNAS, they did the area under the curve. They did the violin plot like this. So what we did was we extend this to get the smooth ROC curve. So you can think about if you have the ordinal data, it's going to be very difficult to get a smooth curve. You can actually get the limited number of false positive rate and the true positive rate and connect other dots, but then it's going to be very rough plot. So what we want to do is we want to get a smooth ROC curve, and we also want to do regression to account for the covariates. So for example, one of the covariates in this case is the examiner group, the face examiner and face reviewer, superrecognizer, and the fingerprint examiners. So that's actually what our research is. And to be able to do it, we have to define the so-called latent continuous variable. So that's actually, once we have the latent continuous variable, we can actually build a regression on that. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to do that on the ordinal scores. So here's the idea of that. So here, the R here, there are the ordinal scores. So that's the scores we get from the black box study. And we assume the ordinal scores come from the continuous scores, so continuous variable. And we just basically give the cutoff points to the continuous variable, and then we can get the ordinal score. So that's the basic idea. And then we can build the model on this continuous variable. So that's the assumption here. We assume this underlying continuous latent variable T has a normal distribution. So you can use other distribution as well, but normal distribution is the most commonly used distribution. So we assume this T has a normal distribution, then we can say the score less than this continuous latent variable less than or equals to this threshold, the probability of that is going to be given by this. And here, X is the covariate. So this covariate could be a lot of things. Could be examiner groups, could be age of the examiner, could be the experience of examiner, could be also the characteristics from the images as well. And the unique thing here in the model is this D here. D indicate whether the score come from same source or different sources. So that's actually unique in our modeling. So once we have this latent distribution, we can actually get the mean and the standard deviation of the genuine score and the imposed score. So you can see here, the mean standard deviation, they all have this covariate here. That means as the covariate changes, you will get different mean and a different standard deviation for genuine score and the imposed scores. So once we know the mean and the standard deviation, we will be able to build the ROC curve. So you can see from here, it actually looks a little bit complicated, a lot of symbols here, but we just need to know, once we get the mean and the standard deviation, we have the explicit formula for the ROC curve, and it's going to be a function of this covariate. So this alpha, beta, we get those parameters from the ordinal regression. And also we can get the area under the curve. So that's going to be given by this formula here. So we can see here, ROC curve and AUC, they are both covariate specific. So that actually allows us to get different error rates for different covariates. For example, if the covariate is the examiner group, we will be able to get a ROC curve for a face examiner, another ROC curve for, say, fingerprint examiner. So that's actually going to capture the whole, all the information of, say, false positive rate versus true positive rate for all the possible thresholds. So that's actually nice thing about the ROC curve. So here shows how we can apply the method to the face recognition study. So we did the ordinal regression and we used the formula, we got the ROC curve. So you can see actually this face examiner and the super recognizer, they are very close, like this curve here, this curve here, they are very close. So if we get the area under the curve, like the PNAS paper did, then their area under the curve are quite similar. But if we look at the whole curve, they have some overlap, but some areas they are different. And we can also see here, fingerprint examiners, they tend to have lowest ROC curve compared to other groups of examiners. And we can also get the confidence band for the ROC curve. So that means we will have, say, 95% confidence to say the ROC curve is going to be in this area. So that's actually the nice thing about the approach. So we are able to get the entire ROC curve and not just the area under the curve, which is only the summary measure of the ROC curve. And also it allows us to compare the ROC curves and also the area under the curve. So for example, we compare the area under the curve like this. So you can see there's, if the confidence interval covers 0, that means there's no significant difference. Like for the face examiner versus super recognizer, the confidence interval includes 0, and also reviewers versus super recognizer, the confidence interval covers 0. That means there's no significant difference. And for fingerprint examiner versus super recognizer, so you can say confidence interval doesn't cover 0. That means super recognizer actually performs better than the fingerprint examiners. So that means super recognizer, even they didn't get much formal training, but since they have really higher than usual ability in recognizing faces, they are doing better than fingerprint examiners. So we can also tell it from here. So this difference between the ROC curve and also the confidence interval will tell us more complete picture of where they really differ, in which region of the false positive rate they're gonna differ. So you can see here, when you compare facial examiner versus facial reviewers, facial reviewers, they are actually mostly doing better than facial examiners. They are doing mostly better than facial reviewers. And you can see at a higher false positive rate, facial examiners are doing much better. And facial examiners and super recognizer, so you can see facial examiners are doing slightly better, but there's no statistical significance here. So that actually, the results agrees with what the PNAS paper presented. So the examiners who got formal training in facial recognition, they actually will do better than just normal people. But of course, super recognizers, they are not really normal people. So they can probably do as well as the facial recognizers, the facial examiners. So you can see from here, that's one perspective of using the covariate in the regression. So here the covariate is the examiner group. And we, of course, can account for the experience and also age, gender of the examiners and be able to characterize the error rates based on those covariates. So that actually will give us the more, specialized, I would say this is more almost like a personalized medicine. You will be able to kind of find out the accuracy in the subgroup instead of just the whole population. So sometimes just one size doesn't really fit all. So one error rate may be meaningful, but doesn't really tell the whole picture of how the different group of examiners really perform. So to summarize what we have done, so we did the ordinal regression, so we can get the smooth ROC curve, and we can also do the ROC regression to be able to get the error rate for different covariates. And our future research is to be able to do the formal power and the sample size analysis through homogeneity test. So that means if we try to design a black box study, say for example in fingerprint face recognition, we want to know how many samples we need, how many subjects we need, how many pairs of images we need. So we will be able to use the ROC regression to be able to give us some guidance on the sample size. And we are also trying to develop a Shiny app to implement the methods I just presented. So that way, people can actually use our Shiny app to implement, to input their data and get the similar results I just presented. So I would like to thank NIJ for the generous support and to me and to my students. And I would also like to thank the audience.
Very good. Thank you for your presentation, Larry. Our next presenter is Jacqueline Spear, an associate professor at West Virginia University. Jacqueline's research focuses on forensic pattern recognition, with specific emphasis on footwear, fingerprints, and crime scene investigation. Today, she'll discuss the spatial distribution of randomly acquired characteristics on footwear outsoles. Thank you for joining us, Professor Spear.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We're grateful for NIJ's support for this research, but acknowledge that the results and opinions expressed are those of the authors. In addition, some of the data that will be presented today was collected using West Virginia University's high performance computing cluster. And this originated from an NSF major research instrumentation grant. So we're likewise grateful for access to the Supercomputing Center. As a basic outline for this presentation, I'll spend a few minutes on slides describing our major goals for the project, then the empirical data that we used in this research, followed by the generation of computer simulations and models to compare with the empirical data, then the statistical tests that we used for those comparisons, and then finally results and conclusions. The overarching goal of this study was to compare the distribution of randomly acquired characteristics, which are also known as RACs, or sometimes referred to as accidentals, collected in a research data set and compare those against simulated and modeled random distributions. The premise was that if we failed to detect a difference between the empirical data and one of these random distributions, then we would be able to make some inferences about the distribution of RACs in the research data set. Now, randomly acquired characteristics are things like nicks and tears that result from the usage of an outsole. And so one is illustrated on the right-hand side of the screen. They are believed to result based upon the interactions between the outsole, the wearer's activities, and the types of terrain that they're walking on. The production of one RAC is not believed to influence, either promote or deter the production of another RAC, which is why they've been given the moniker or label of random. But even if you assume that one RAC does not promote or deter the development of another, it doesn't necessarily mean that the RACs will be randomly or uniformly distributed on the outsole. And this is because the factors that influence RAC acquisition are also unlikely to be uniformly distributed across an outsole. So as an example, the way a wearer distributes his or her weight is assumed to influence the interaction between the outsole and the terrain. And this interaction is assumed to lead to the formation of racks, but there's nothing to suggest that the weight would be distributed uniformly across an outsole when a person is undertaking any particular activity. So to reiterate, our goal was to compare this empirical research data set of racks against simulated and modeled distributions and look for any kind of agreement and disagreement so that we could better understand how racks are distributed on outsoles. So what does the empirical data set look like? Well, it consists of 80% or more of athletic shoes, of which we had 1,300 in total. And from those, we collected 72,306 randomly acquired characteristics. But there are several limiting factors with regard to this data set. And so the first is that the racks we are counting, collecting, and characterizing are restricted to those that can be captured in a two-dimensional data set. So we're actually collecting these in two-dimensional impressions. So that means that the rack distribution we have in this empirical set is restricted to tread features in contact with the ground. So we're not evaluating racks that might exist in a recessed area, either between tread elements or, for example, in an arch or an instep. And so this is illustrated on the right-hand side of the screen, where we're looking at a handy print or a high-quality test impression that has been converted to a binary map. And in this binary map, the black pixels represent tread in contact with the ground. So therefore, locations where we could characterize a rack. And the white indicates recessed areas where, because of our collection mechanism, we're not counting racks in those white areas and or an instep or an arch that's raised. Second, the features that we're counting are all in high quality images. That means we have a very high level of resolution in this data set. And it's unlikely that all of the racks that we marked and characterized in the research data set would show up in a lower quality data set, specifically in crime scene images. So it's important to limit the extrapolation of any conclusions that we draw to any other data set, and especially crime scene images. A third limitation is that the empirical data is a collection of outsoles that vary in make, model, size, wear, and they've all been normalized to a standardized outsole to form what we call a heat map. And we've done this to allow for intercomparison. So there's no regard to the type of outsole material comprising each shoe, tread geometry, wear attributes like gait, foot protonation, their weight, or any of sort of another set of or multitude of uncontrolled factors that could be at play here. So instead, all of these variables are reduced and aggregated to a data set or a heat map, which reflects the number of racks, and that's based upon color in this image, and tread contact, which is based on point diameter. So to illustrate, in the instep of the majority of shoes in our data set, that instep or arch was raised. So we have very few that were actually flat outsoles. Because of that, you see the diameter of the point size is very small in the instep or arch. And the color or number of features collected is low. So we're in this ballpark of greens to blues. Conversely, if you look at the medial ball of the toe, we see that the majority of the shoes have contact in this area, so tread in contact with the ground. And we're also counting a large number in that space, as evidenced by the red to orange color that we see here. So lastly, I mentioned that the shoes vary in their degree of wear, and This means that we have no accounting for whether or not the shoe was extensively used and how the wearer used it in a specific activity. But we know that wear is certainly a visible indicator of the interaction between tread and ground. So this is a way to characterize the strength of that interaction between the tread, the wearer, and the ground and whatever activities they're doing. So we were very much interested in characterizing it. But so far, we've only done it for a subset of the shoes. So 130 shoes or 10% of the database. They were also very broadly defined. So we defined wear as light, moderate, or high. So they were binned into these three broad categories. And using the criteria on this slide, we generated what we refer to as wear maps. So you see the outsole on the left, the handy print in the center, that's the high quality test impression, and the wear map associated with it on the right of the screen. And in this example, we've used dark gray to denote areas of high wear. We've used white to denote areas of moderate or medium wear, and then a light gray to denote areas of low or light wear in our data set. Okay, so at this point, we understand the empirical data set and some of its limitations, but using the spatial position, the count, the tread, and the degree of wear as known parameters for our research data set, we then simulated and modeled rack distributions that conform to specific assumptions. So in terms of our simulations, we employed an R package that can simulate what's referred to as a Poisson point process. Essentially, this means that we are assuming that racks can appear anywhere within a window, and within that window, they have an equal chance of assuming any position. And this is illustrated on the top left, where we see racks confined to a square, a circle, and then an arbitrary window that's listed as the letter R. So we used this idea and applied it to the binary maps. So for example, if a shoe is known to have 50 racks, then these 50 racks were projected onto the tread shoe elements known to be in contact with the ground. And so this is illustrated by the shoe at the bottom of the screen and the zoomed in image on the right-hand side, where the green colored dots show locations where racks were projected onto the tread elements. So the tread elements in contact with the ground are defining the window, but within that window, there's an equal probability that a rack could be projected at that space. So we did this repeatedly for each shoe and generated 1.3 million simulations. So every shoe was sent through this process, and essentially 1,000 or more simulations were created per shoe. And then those shoes were collected to generate 10,000 simulated heat maps that could then be compared to the empirical data set. So in addition to the simulations, we also had two non-spatial generalized linear models that we employed. And so one was based on contact only and what we refer to as bin partiality. So bin partiality essentially means that if you look at this outsole image and you trace the perimeter of it, some of the bins or cells in the heat map are partial because they're on that perimeter, and therefore their area is reduced. And we would expect to take that into account in any kind of modeling that would project racks into that space. So the first model that we generated was non-spatial, but it included contact as a predictor and this bin partiality. And the second model that we employed, which was completed on that smaller data set of 130 shoes, was contact modified wear. And so we have light wear denoted as L, moderate wear denoted as M, and high wear denoted as H, along with that bin partiality. So we're using this smaller subset to determine if wear is increasing our ability to make predictions when we add it to known contact. Okay, so as a recap at this point, We have our empirical data set, and that empirical data set is comprised of the 1,300 shoes. All 1,300 were characterized for their contact, and this generated both simulations and models. But a smaller subset, the 130, were characterized for both contact and wear, and then we use these for modeling. So armed with the empirical and the simulated model data, we then compared the distribution, so the empirical to each of those types of distributions. So as a reminder, in the distributions that we simulated and we modeled, we assumed that racks could fall or their location could exist anywhere on an outsole that was in contact with the ground, and then a subset of these using wear as the predictor. So we essentially have these predictors that are informing random distributions, and now we want to know the agreement between these and the empirical data set. So agreement was determined in two ways. The first was a Poisson rate test. And essentially this amounts to comparing the count or the frequency of racks in cells in the empirical versus the simulated and the modeled. And so we're seeking to determine if there are any differences that we can detect. And under the null hypothesis, they are equivalent. So the empirical data set is equivalent to the simulated and modeled. The second metric that we used is referred to as local Moran's eye, and this looks for correlation. So we computed the residuals between the empirical data, so the rack count in a particular cell, versus the simulated and the modeled. And then we used those residuals to compute the metric known as local Moran's eye. And we use this metric to determine if the residuals showed any kind of pattern like clustering. Right, so this slide compares the frequency of racks in the empirical data set versus the 10,000 simulations. And the most important thing to focus on here are the red, orange, and yellowed colored cells. So you notice that these seem to, there's a sporadic random distribution of them, but what you're noticing is there's certainly a cluster in the medial ball of the toe, and there's another cluster that looks like it could exist in the heel. And so overall, what we essentially found was that in approximately a quarter of the locations on the outsole, the random simulations poorly described the empirical data. So the same sort of pattern existed when we looked at the spatial local autocorrelation with Moran's eye. Again, in this case, we can see that there are clusters of red locations in the medial ball of the toe and the heel, which are indicating that there's clusters of residuals, and we have actually over prediction and under prediction. So the simulations under predicted the count of racks in the medial ball of the toe, and they over predicted those in the heel. So again, we're at this approximately 30% being poorly predicted ballpark. Right, so moving on to the modeled data, we see the exact same types of patterns with our models. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the full data set of the 1,300 shoes. On the right-hand side, you see the subset of 130 shoes. And we're only looking at how contact alone helped us with predictions. And we see that we're in the ballpark of 30 being or showing significant differences for the full data set and 21% for the smaller data set. And again, they cluster in the medial ball of the toe, the heel, and this time the arch or instep is now being introduced, whereas before we had less significant differences in that area. So we also repeated this using local Moran's eye, and again, we see sort of that same pattern popping up where we have correlations in the medial ball of the toe, correlations in the heel, and correlations in the instep or the arch. So what does this mean so far? Well, essentially, rack frequency in about 60 to 70% of the spatial locations on our outsoles in the empirical data set seem to be reasonably well predicted by tread contact modified Poisson point processes. But somewhere between 30 and 40% are not well predicted. And these tend to be the ball of the toe, the heel, and the arch. So the next question would be, if we add in wear, do we improve our agreement? And so what you're looking at on this screen is the contact model on the left-hand side for the 130 shoes. And using those same 130 shoes, the contact plus wear model. So using contact and wear as a predictor. And so for contact alone, 79% of the spatial locations are well predicted. But when we add in wear, that increased to 84% of all spatial locations. So the results based on contact and wear show us that between 70 and 80% of the spatial locations on the outsole are reasonably well explained using contact as a predictor. Interestingly, though, we see this consistent pattern where models and simulations under-predict counts in the medial ball of the toe, and they over-predict it in the heel and the arch. So overall, we can say that agreement between the modeled and the empirical counts increases to about 84% when wear is added as this predictor. So what are our major conclusions so far? Well, we made this assertion that the factors that control the degree and the strength of interaction between an outsole and a wearer, the terrain that they're walking on, are unlikely to be uniformly distributed over an outsole, and some of those factors may not even be readily observable in the outsoles. From this, we then made the deduction that racks result from these interactions, and therefore they are unlikely to be uniformly distributed. Based upon all that, with the empirical data, the models, and the simulations, we were able to observe that contact and degree of wear are reasonable first-order predictors of rack count, but neither are uniformly distributed over an outsole. So the results that we have found thus far should be interpreted with regard to limitations in the empirical data set. The first is that our research data set disregards make, model, size, and outsole material, along with all wearer attributes. It's also important to remember that these shoes were normalized to a standardized shoe, and that normalization process could introduce artifacts. A second issue is that we used our high quality handprints to create the binary tread contact maps. And of course, that process might have been less than perfect. Another issue is that wear was defined broadly as light, moderate, and high, and we only evaluated it on 10% of our data set, so 130 shoes as a seed project. It's also unclear if high wear as a predictor may sometimes be associated with more and sometimes associated with fewer racks, and that this could vary with position. For instance, Davis and DeHaan in 1977 examined 650 pairs of men's shoes and found fewer racks in the rear heel, and they attributed this to high wear causing erosion. So intuition may indicate that high wear areas have a large number of racks, but they also may have a low number of racks due to erosion, and it may vary with position. High wear is also sometimes associated with Chalamet patterns, and Chalamet patterns are considered to be extremely discriminating. They have high evidential value, but they're given a different name. They're not called a randomly acquired characteristic, and we did not mark Chalamet patterns in our data set. Anecdotally, we can say that when shallow macs are present, racks aren't present at that location. So this may be a factor in the distributions we're observing. And I have a graduate student currently looking at shallow mac patterns in this data set to see how that might improve prediction. Finally, this is a high quality data set with very high resolution of features. And there's no indication that all of these features would transfer to crime scene impressions. So it's important to be careful about extrapolating the distribution in the high data set to any other data set. However, I think the results that we're finding are informative and useful for us to make some inferences with regard to how racks are distributed in our data set. And as a last thing to know, I definitely want to say that we can do a better job modeling and get differences down to 2 to 3%. But in order to do that, we have to use a spatial model. So it allows variation spatially across a shoe. So what we gain in the ability to model counts, we're sort of trading off knowledge of the predictors and the factors that are causing that variation. So although we do have the capacity to model the data at a very high level, unfortunately, doing so means we don't understand as well the physical predictors. So if there is more time and I'm able to answer questions, I'm happy to do that now.
All right, hello. Thank you, Jacqueline, for that talk. And thank you to all three of our speakers from this part of the session. We are very pleased to have with us Tom, Larry, and Jacqueline in the Q&A. So I'd like to thank them for taking the time to be with us here, and also thank the audience and remind the audience, please go ahead and keep entering your questions into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we get them addressed in this session. So welcome, Tom, Larry, and Jacqueline. Got a number of great questions here. I realize that the three talks are a little different, but there may be some overlapping themes. I'm going to jump in and first hand some questions to Tom. Tom, the first question has to do with the part one that you talked about of calibrating the articulation language. We have a question asking, the vertical scales are set up to be skewed to the extremes. In other words, 80 to 100 is about half of the scale, whereas it's only 20% numerically. Could this have influenced the results?
Yeah, good question. So there are a couple of issues here. In thinking about the scales basically extend to infinity or nearly. So it's hard to think about labeling the endpoints. But if you have a fingerprint with 17 matching or corresponding minutiae, the evidentiary value is super high. So it's unclear exactly how high is high. So ultimately, the best part of the analyses for that study looked at the ordinal relations, just whether one statement was placed above another, and then used a variant of the generalized linear model to come up with a metric scale that describes how much more a given statement is viewed as providing more strength than another statement. We've analyzed it in different ways. We stressed a lot about, should that scale be expanded or not? Ultimately, I think just relying on the ordinal relations is the most conservative way to approach that data analysis, because we simply don't know how people are compressing or expanding the endpoints of those scales.
Talking about that, you did note that I think both the examiners and the lay people struggled with the quantitative statements, so random match probabilities and likelihood ratios. That seemed pretty interesting, especially that the examiners also struggled. The question is, could this be corrected with additional training or explanation?
So I think any scale that first of all, the random match probabilities is a little bit less well understood in the fingerprint community because they don't yet rely on statistics like that or likelihood ratios. But I think in looking at another question, the likelihood ratios are very difficult for lay people to understand. And even for scientists who understand how they work, it's hard to translate that into sort of how much more guilty is this person than innocent, given that I just heard a likelihood ratio from a DNA analyst of 100,000 or something like that. It's really hard to think, oh my God, they're now 100,000 times more guilty than they were before. That is even a hard, from a lay person's perspective, that's hard to understand. So you're absolutely right. There are challenges anytime you are presenting numerical information to an audience that may not be super sophisticated numerically.
At the end of your talk, I think some of your conclusions, included some statements about the utility of the categorical conclusions versus strength of support. We have a question that mentions, you mentioned that the goal is to move toward likelihood ratios. I'm not sure if you mentioned that, you meant that, but maybe strength of support. But wouldn't these need some verbal description of strength in order to interpret what the numbers mean? So
yes, so absolutely.
Yeah.
Likelihood ratios in the DNA world, where they're used habitually, I came across two different verbal equivalence scales, and they were off by orders and orders of magnitude. So strong support for common source was associated with a likelihood ratio of 10,000 in one scale, and associated with a likelihood ratio of 1 million in another scale. So even among the verbal equivalencies, there's vast disagreement. I think giving people some kind of landmarks for likelihood ratios, or for example, what's the probability of having breast cancer given you have a particular gene versus what's the probability of getting breast cancer given you don't have that gene, that there's an odds ratio for that. And we might be able to say, here is an example that people might be familiar with from experience of family members or whatever, translate that likelihood ratio in that you kind of understand from the cancer context into the forensic context. So that might be another way to approach things that doesn't involve verbal equivalence, but it's going to be challenging regardless.
So I understand that likelihood ratios are already used in Europe in court routinely. Do they already have a sort of a common scale linking the likelihood ratios to some sort of verbal statement that they use? Because I understand maybe there's some difficulty in applying the same scale and statements across disciplines. Can you comment on sort of trying to match the two across disciplines?
Sure. The fundamental problem with categorical conclusions as they're expressed now, especially the posteriors like identification, is that they implicitly require an understanding of the priors. That is how good your detectives are, how likely you are to get a mated pair, even before you look at it. And that can vary widely depending on if you're talking about financial crime or property crime. So the fact that that's routinely ignored in the pattern comparison disciplines is pretty amazing. And one way to move away from that is to move to likelihood ratios, where you explicitly just describe the strength of the evidence and let the jury apply their own priors based on, because they know the full facts of the case.
Okay, I think that maybe matches up with another question we have, which is kind of some of the current statements that are made now in the US. Do you think the examination of pattern evidence in terms of level of agreement can be summarized in only 3 categories? Or is that too simplified an approach?
Yeah, so another great question. The problem right now is that our consumers, like a detective or a prosecutor, they want a go, no-go signal. They want to know, is this the guy? And the fingerprint examiner should not make that statement because they don't have all the facts of the case. So there's a disconnect between what the consumer wants and what the examiner is able to provide. Anytime you threshold into like 3 categories, you effectively have a continuous scale happening in the person's head, the examiner's head. You're thresholding that into 3 categories. You're losing information when you do that. So that's why an expanded scale is preferred. And I think 7 is probably the right numbers. I think OSAC may be moving towards something like 3 categories, but then saying, is it a borderline? That's maybe moving in the right direction. But again, that approach, as long as you're doing posteriors, ignores the prior probability issue, and that's a problem.
Yeah, it does seem like some disciplines in the OSAC standards that are proposed really are moving toward expanded scales generally. Footwear in your study was one that matched up well. So there wasn't as much disagreement between the different scales that I think they already use an expanded scale. Is that why they did a better job of matching up?
Actually, I think the reason that footwear people weren't affected by the different scale as much is that their scale uses this phrase association. So there's like a strong association or limited association, high degree of association. I think that word association is key. And I love that phrase because it gets us away from an action of identified. That identified is 100%, you're making a conclusion, and that's not your job as a fingerprint examiner. Association, you're expressing the strength of the observations. It reads much more like a probability statement or a likelihood ratio statement. So I think maybe they're already thinking in terms of ambiguity and association, and that's why this switch to language didn't really affect them.
Interesting. Jacqueline, I know you've done some error rate studies in footwear before. Are you surprised that the footwear examiners did a comparable job with the different scales?
So I want to say no, I wasn't surprised. But I think the reason that I'm saying that is because there's so much training and discussion that has gone into their scale that I think the community's interpretation of it is fairly consistent. And that may, that level of training and adherence to such a complicated, it is a complicated system. It has very many categories, probably has resulted or contributed to this, but it's definitely speculating.
So they already came in with a good level of familiarity with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tom, it's interesting. So you would argue maybe that even identification, I know that latent prints have definitely moved away from the old word of individualization. And now they have a kind of a source identification type of language. You would argue maybe they should get away from that maybe that is too biasing to the consumers.
There's a running joke that we should call it the International Association for Extremely Strong Support for Common Source. And, I don't, language really affects people who don't really understand the science, and they're processing things at a very surface level. And if an examiner comes in and seems very confident and makes a very definitive statement like identified, that carries a lot of weight. Now, juries also are kind of sophisticated, and there's lots of television effects, and so what we're giving them is not maybe what they're expecting, because they're expecting a computer to come in and go match. So I think things are pretty complex, but I think we just have to be true to really what is the strength of the evidence and what can a latent print examiner say, or any discipline in the pattern comparison disciplines. And that's really, they can talk about the strength that they're observing in their data, in their observations, and they should limit their conclusions to what they can observe and be clear about that.
Larry, your talk has some overlap, I think, with Tom's. So you were talking about the sort of post hoc analysis of this facial identification study. And they used a kind of ordinal scale that is very similar. I think it shares some similarities. I'm wondering basically you took the data set from this existing study and tried to see what you could make out of it in teasing out these different populations. We have a question here. If there's no significant difference between the study covariate populations, so some of them had no differences, some did. Can a single error rate or range be used, or would you still report the error rates calculated for each?
Yeah, I would say I would report both the single error rate based on all the data and also the error rates based on the covariate of interest. So just like when you do prediction in linear regression, so no matter whether the covariate is significant or not, you still use all the covariate for prediction. So here is the same thing. We still want to say for certain, say, experience we want to say, here's the error rate for this experience, say 10 years experience, 5 year experience. So that's going to give us actually a clear picture of how the really different people perform regarding like their face recognition or all kinds of forensic identification.
So for that study, they very purposefully, I think, included these different categories of people who were doing the comparisons, right? So that's why you analyze that. You did note that there were some other sort of subcategories that might be of interest to study. So for facial, it's things like race, age. For other disciplines, are there other things similar to that might be studied? Or are there issues of like just image quality or complexity? What could you talk about for sort of using this in other disciplines?
Yeah, that's another great question. So basically, we did similar analysis for fingerprint. So we found out there's say gender, there's age, and also clarity and image quality that can all affect the accuracy, the error rate. So there's actually another study we are looking at. We try to look at the fingerprint quality from NIST, the NFIQ quality, and see how the quality will affect the accuracy, especially with all this like deep learning AI type of methods in fingerprint recognition. We try to see whether there's still any correlation there.
Another question for you. How do you anticipate this method and/or error rates being used in forensic science in the future? And I guess I would like to know, are there plans to incorporate this into the design of error rate studies to try to get more information out?
Yeah, actually, there are two ways. One way is we can say, here's the statistical test. We can say what's going to be the sample size. For example, if we want to achieve certain accuracy, how many examiners do we need? How many face images do we need? That's one way. The other way is to really say, just use our method and say what's the error rate for different characteristics of say face images or different characteristics of these different disciplines. So we're actually planning to develop a Shiny app so everyone can just put in their data and try to come up with some answer.
That I think sounds great. It also, I think, argues for open data sharing from these studies, which is a great thing, which many of them have done. So they make that available for you and others to do these analyses. Jacqueline, we have a couple of questions on yours. So one of them is just talking about resolution. What resolution to use as high resolution, and what effect does the resolution have on the distribution results that you got versus what might be encountered in real casework?
Sure. So these are all test impressions. So when I say high resolution, not only were they scanned at 600 pixels per inch, but they also have extremely high resolving power. So we're able to see racks that are a few millimeters in size. Whereas if you were talking crime scene impressions that had an interaction between matrix and media, you know, some of those smaller impressions may very well not transfer. And so we're looking at a distribution that is possible. So the highest level possible. It doesn't mean that that distribution would be transferred to crime scene. And anecdotally, we know that something like 80% or more of randomly acquired characteristics are often lost from a high quality to a crime scene impression because of all those factors.
Another question, do you plan to expand the number of shoes in which you've characterized wear? So actually, I think what we'd like to do in terms of a cost-benefit analysis is to look at shallow MAC patterns and try to determine if shallow MAC patterns, which are, you know, they're definitely considered a randomly acquired feature, they're just given this special name, and we didn't mark them. But it could be that there are areas of high wear
that show Shallamack and are inversely proportional to what we're quantifying as racks. And so I think for a cost benefit, we'd like to look at Shallamack areas first, perhaps mark that 130 shoes to determine where the Shallamack patterns are. And if there's an interaction term between high wear and Shallamack, that might be a better predictor.
Great. I think we've gone over what we had planned for the Q&A. So thank you again to Tom, Larry, and Jacqueline. We will take a short break till 11:45, and then we'll continue with the trace evidence sessions.